Thank you so much for joining me for this video. If you have a cheap 4Q firing system and are wondering how far you can push things with ematches, that's how many igniters you can fire from 1Q or how far you can extend them, then this video is for you. This is a follow-up to my previous video where I was testing the same unit but with a completely different type of igniter called a talon, which is a clip-on igniter. The igniters in this video then are what I think I can refer to as standard ematches. So here you have a small explosive head. There's also a small plastic shroud as well. A couple of other differences. Ematches require less power than talons to fire, so we'd usually expect to be able to fire more ematches than we can talons at any given distance. And ematches can be wired in series or parallel, whereas talons should only be wired in parallel. All of the ematches I'm firing today are the same length. They're between 25 and 30 centimeters. And the extension wire, the bell wire I'm using, is from Toolstation. It's the same as the previous video. It's by a company called Pitax, and I'll put the details up on the screen for you. Let's jump in then with the first test. Let me show you the setup. So I'm going to try and fire 10 ematch igniters. These are wired in series using Fargo connectors to make setting up a bit quicker for me. And I'm firing these at the end of 1 meter of bell wire, so very short distance. The wiring in series is essentially chaining these together one after the other, a bit like old-fashioned Christmas tree lights. I'm also testing something else out here, and that's using ematches to light visco. For the first test, all I'm doing is shoving the ematch down the shroud and putting it all tight so that the igniter head is very snugly against the outside of the visco. This is quite a common way people use to light visco with ematches, although note that I'm not taping them in or anything here. I'm literally just pushing the visco down the shroud. Let's see what happened then. I did jump out of my skin here, I'm afraid. I forgot again that when you light multiple ematches and stand right next to them, it does make quite a loud noise. At least I didn't drop the camera though. Okay, that's very interesting, and we have good news and bad news. The good news is that all 10 igniters did go off. So we can answer a question, can this system fire 10 ematches in series on 1 meter of bell wire? The answer is yes. However, as you can see here, 9 out of 10 pieces of visco failed to ignite. Looking more closely at the visco, you can see that the outer casing, the protective sheath on the visco, has been scorched, but the ematch hasn't been powerful enough to actually burn through this and ignite the powder underneath. I should point out as well that I didn't tape these in, so the flame could dissipate out of the end. That could make a difference. But clearly, shoving visco down the end of these shrouds, even if the igniter head is very snugly against the fuse, does not seem to be a reliable way to get visco going. Now, although the test was a success in the sense that I was testing if 10 igniters would fire and 10 did, I want to repeat this test, exactly the same setup, but here what I'm doing is I'm using a widget to connect the visco to the igniter. The idea with these is you put the visco in one end, you fold it over, then insert the ematch. This helps to ensure that the flame from the igniter goes onto the end of the fuse where the powder is exposed, and this should hopefully make things a bit more reliable. It also encloses the fuse and the igniter, so hopefully that will help concentrate the heat on the fuse. Okay, let's see what happens this time. So great news, I managed not to drop the camera despite jumping again. All 10 igniters went off as they did before, and this time all 10 pieces of visco also ignited, which was good to see. Let's go large now and push things out to the end of 10 meters of bell wire. In my previous video I could only fire 2 talons at this distance. Any more than that wouldn't fire at all. I'm going to stick with 10 ematch igniters for this first test. I've also worked out by this point that it's going to be better putting my camera on a mini tripod on the table and retiring to a safe distance to press the button. Let's see what happens this time. At first glance, it looks like all 10 fired okay because all 10 pieces of visco have fired. And this is what I thought at the time, and it's why I stick with 10 for the next test. However, after I'd packed up and I looked at the video clips a little closer, I noticed this. If you look at this widget, the visco fuse is burning from the outside into the igniter, which is the wrong way around. In actual fact, I managed to retrieve that exact igniter from the wheelie bin afterwards, and I can confirm the visco has burnt, but the igniter itself hasn't fired. So at 10 meters and in series, 9 out of 10 igniters have fired, but one failed. I'm going to double the distance now to 20 meters of bell wire, and I'm still sticking with 10 igniters because I didn't realise that not all 10 had fired in the previous test. So let's see how we get on with 10 igniters at 20 meters. By this point as well, having fired 20 out of 20 pieces of visco using this widget, I decide to not use these anymore and focus solely on the igniters. This just helps speed up setting up for me. So let's see how we get on with this. At 20 meters then, only 2 out of 10 igniters fire. As these are wired in series, that has broken the circuit, so repeatedly refiring the others is not an option, which you might get with parallel wiring. Okay, so as only 2 worked, I'm going to drop down to 15 meters now, and again I'm going to try firing 10 and see what happens. At 15 meters then, 4 fire okay, but 6 fail. This would be a good point to stress that today's tests are not meant to be an exhaustive look at how many ematches fire at each distance of bell wire. Instead, look at this as a more general test to see where the limits of the system might lie. With that in mind, I decided for the next test to fire 4 ematches on their own at 15 meters, just to make sure that we can reliably light 4 and it wasn't just a fluke. All 4 fire okay at 15 meters, so along the same lines, I'm now jumping back up to 20 meters before 2 out of 10 fired. So I'm going to try 2 on their own to make sure that we can reproduce this as well. Both of those fire okay at 20 meters. After initially clearing everything away, but then seeing on the video that one failed at 10 meters, I decided to do one final test. So here I'm using my last remaining 6 igniters. I'm firing them at 10 meters to make sure that 6 will fire okay. And as you can see here, I'm also using the widgets again, just for one final test to see if we can get all 6 pieces of visco ignited. The good news, first of all 6 igniters fired okay, so we've shown here that 6 will fire no problems at all at 10 meters. But alas, complete disaster after 100% success rate with the widgets. As you can see here, 3 out of 6 didn't fire the visco. Opening up the widgets that failed, you can see that the igniter has gone off, it's scorched the plastic and it's also scorched the visco, but for some reason the fuse did not ignite. So why did they fail? Why have we had 100% success rate and then now 3 out of 6 fail to go? The fuse is the same, the igniters are from the same batch, the firing system is the same, the setup is, as far as I can tell, the same as well. I have a couple of theories, and these are just theories at this stage. I'm going to have to do a lot more testing on this to give a more definitive answer. The first theory is that I believe the success to lighting visco with ematches is to make sure that the flame from the igniter goes onto the end of the fuse where the powder is exposed, rather than trying to burn through the outer sheath of the fuse. So many people have said to me after watching some of my fusing videos, Pete, you just need to shove the fuse down the shroud so that the igniter is snug against the fuse and it will work every time. But in actual fact, when I do that, I get the most failures because these ematches are just not powerful enough to burn through the outer sheath every time. When using these widgets, it's entirely down to you when you're putting the fuse in, how much visco you put in. And also when you put the igniter in, it's down to you how far up the plastic sheath the igniter head is before you secure it all off. So there is a possibility, I think, that the ematch head could be too far away from the end of the visco, or the end of the visco is going beyond the igniter itself, so the igniter is firing against the protective sheath and not against any exposed powder. I will be doing a lot more testing on this to see if there is a particular amount of visco to insert into this and a particular place for the igniter which is much more reliable. The other theory I've had is the possibility that there is an inconsistency with the quality and the power of the ematches that I'm using. I've had this nagging feeling for a couple of years using these ematches in so many of my igniter tests. Sometimes they flare up quite violently, sometimes they pop loudly, sometimes they just flare up quite gently. I'm wondering perhaps if the ones that fail don't have as much explosive content on them. Is this something that's just inherent with cheap ematches? Are the better quality ematches we should be using instead? I'm going to be doing a lot more testing on that to see if we can find that out. Some may argue that firing 23 out of 26 pieces of visco is a good success rate, but for me it's not, because the 3 that failed could be your finale or one half of a fanned sequence. This is why, for me, I'm trying to get to a method that is 100% reliable. Some conclusions now, and let's start with a summary of the results. At 1 metre of bell wire, all 10 ematches wired in series fired OK on both occasions. At 10 metres of bell wire, 9 out of 10 fired, then 6 out of 6 fired. At 15 metres, 4 out of 10 fired, then 4 out of 4 fired. And at 20 metres, 2 out of 10 fired, but then 2 on their own successfully fired. As with my other extension tests then, we've shown that the more you extend the wire, the less igniters are going to work. From today's tests, I would reach 3 conclusions. The first is that for any given length of bell wire that you extend with, you can fire more ematches than you can talons. I don't think that was a surprising result, given that talons are a heated element that needs a little bit more power to get going. A reminder that in my previous video at 10 metres I could only fire 2 talons, whereas at that same distance today 9 out of 10 ematches, then 6 out of 6 fired with no problems at all. Also, ematches can be wired in series, which for me at least is a lot quicker and easier to set up. The second conclusion is that reliably igniting visco from ematches continues to be something that perplexes me. Maybe I'm just unlucky or cursed or something. I had thought that we had 100% success with these widgets, but sadly today 3 have failed. So I think a lot more testing is going to need to be done with those, not just on the method of using the widgets, but I think now I'm going to start looking a lot more closely at the ematches themselves and maybe fire some of these off not connected to anything to see if my theory that there is an inconsistency in their power holds up. And thirdly, putting the visco element to one side and looking just at the number of igniters you can fire, I think we can safely conclude that at a short extension, say 1 metre, you can happily fire 10. At 10 metres I would be happy to fire 6, at 15 metres 4, and 2 at 20 metres. Well, that's all from me for today. It's been a tale of two halves really. On the one hand, it's very good to be able to do some practical testing on this system and find some of its limits with ematches. On the other hand, after having such good results with these widgets, I'm so disappointed to have had some failures. However, this is all useful information because from here we can do more testing and see if we can really narrow down what's going on with failures to light visco. Well, on that note, I will say goodbye. I'm off to order some more visco, some more igniters and some more widgets, and also to have a cup of tea. So I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.